20. That Christians have no authority for committing suicide in any circumstances whatever. It is not without significance that in no passage of the holy canonical books there can be found either divine precept or permission to take away our own life, whether for the sake of entering on the enjoyment of immortality, or of shunning, or ridding ourselves of anything whatever. Nay, the law, rightly interpreted, even prohibits suicide, where it says, "Thou shalt not kill." This is proved specially by the omission of the words, "thy neighbor," which are inserted when false witness is forbidden. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Nor yet should any one on this account suppose he has not broken this commandment if he has borne false witness only against himself. For the love of our neighbor is regulated by the love of ourselves, as it is written, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." If then he who makes false statements about himself is not less guilty of bearing false witness than if he had made them to the injury of his neighbor, although in the commandment prohibiting false witness only his neighbor is mentioned, and persons taking no pains to understand it might suppose that a man was allowed to be a false witness to his own hurt. How much greater reason have we to understand that a man may not kill himself, since in the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," there is no limitation added, nor any exception made in favor of anyone, and least of all in favor of him on whom the command is laid. And so some attempt to extend this command even to beasts and cattle, as if it forbade us to take life from any creature. But if so, why not extend it also to the plants, and all that is rooted in and nourished by the earth? For though this class of creatures have no sensation, yet they also are said to live, and consequently they can die, and therefore if violence be done to them, can be killed. So, too, the Apostle, when speaking of the seeds of such things as these, says, "That which thou sowest is not quickened except it die." And in the Psalm it is said, "He killed their vines with hail." Must we therefore reckon it a breaking of this commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," to pull a flower? Are we thus insanely to countenance the foolish error of the Manichaeans? Putting aside, then, these ravings, if, when we say, "Thou shalt not kill," we do not understand this of the plants, since they have no sensation, nor of the irrational animals that fly, swim, walk, or creep, since they are dissociated from us by their want of reason, and are, therefore, by the just appointment of the Creator, subjected to us to kill or keep alive for our own uses. If so, then it remains that we understand that commandment simply of man. The commandment is, "Thou shalt not kill man." Therefore, neither another nor yourself, for he who kills himself still kills nothing else than man. 21. Of the cases in which we may put men to death without incurring the guilt of murder. However, there are some exceptions made by the divine authority to its own law, that men may not be put to death. These exceptions are of two kinds, being justified either by a general law or by a special commission granted for a time to some individual. And in this latter case, he to whom authority is delegated and who is but the sword in the hand of him who uses it, is not himself responsible for the death he deals. And accordingly, they who have waged war in obedience to the divine command, or in conformity with his laws, have represented in their persons the public justice, or the wisdom of government, and in this capacity have put to death wicked men. Such persons have by no means violated the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Abraham, indeed, was not merely deemed guiltless of cruelty, but was even applauded for his piety, because he was ready to slay his son in obedience to God, not to his own passion. And it is reasonably enough made a question whether we are to esteem it to have been in compliance with the command of God that Jephthah killed his daughter, because she met him when he had vowed that he would sacrifice to God whatever first met him as he returned victorious from battle. Samson, too, who drew down the house on himself and his foes together, is justified only on this ground, that the Spirit who wrought wonders by him had given him secret instructions to do this. With the exception, then, of these two classes of cases, which are justified either by a just law that applies generally, or by a special intimation from God himself, the fountain of all justice, whoever kills a man, either himself or another, is implicated in the guilt of murder. 22. That suicide can never be prompted by magnanimity. But they who have laid violent hands on themselves are perhaps to be admired for their greatness of soul, though they cannot be applauded for the soundness of their judgment. However, if you look at the matter more closely, you will scarcely call it greatness of soul, which prompts a man to kill himself rather than bear up against some hardships of fortune, or sins in which he is not implicated. Is it not rather proof of a feeble mind to be unable to bear either the pains of bodily servitude or the foolish opinion of the vulgar? And is it not that to be pronounced the greater mind, which rather faces than flees the ills of life, and which, in comparison of the light and purity of conscience, holds in small esteem the judgment of men, and specially of the vulgar, which is frequently involved in the mist of error? And therefore, if suicide is to be esteemed a magnanimous act, none can take higher rank for magnanimity than Cleobrotus, who, as the story goes, when he had read Plato's book, in which he treats of the immortality of the soul, threw himself from a wall, and so passed from this life to that which he believed to be better. For he was not hard pressed by calamity, nor by any accusation, false or true, which he could not very well have lived down. There was, in short, no motive, but only magnanimity urging him to seek death, and break away from the sweet detention of this life. And yet that this was magnanimous, rather than a justifiable action, Plato himself, whom he had read, would have told him, for he would certainly have been forward to commit, or at least recommend suicide, had not the same bright intellect which saw that the soul was immortal, discerned also that to seek immortality by suicide was to be prohibited rather than encouraged. Again, it is said many have killed themselves to prevent an enemy doing so. But we are not inquiring whether it has been done, but whether it ought to have been done. Sound judgment is to be preferred even to examples, and indeed, examples harmonize with the voice of reason. But not all examples, but those only which are distinguished by their piety, and are proportionately worthy of imitation. For suicide, we cannot cite the example of patriarchs, prophets, or apostles. Though our Lord Jesus Christ, when he admonished them to flee from city to city, if they were persecuted, might very well have taken that occasion to advise them to lay violent hands on themselves, and so escape their persecutors. But seeing he did not do this, nor propose this mode of departing this life, though he were addressing his own friends for whom he had promised to prepare everlasting mansions, it is obvious that such examples as are produced from the nations that forget God give no warrant of imitation to the worshippers of the one true God.